Hello there. Today I thought I would talk to you about the second half of my reading for October. It was a longer month. I didn't realise it was going to be that long, so I've got quite a lot read, so let's get straight into it with the first book, which was Jessie Burton's The Muse. Now this is Jessie Burton's second book. This is the author of The Miniaturist, which was her debut novel, and I've had a thing for Jessie Burton for a while, ever since reading her blog post, which I will link down below. It's quite long, but it is well worth a read, and it basically, she wrote that in the aftermath of the Miniaturist, which, as I say, it was her debut novel, but it went absolutely crazy. It was a bestseller. I think there was a bit of a publisher bid for it when she first sent it out on submission, and it was kind of one of those author stories that you always dream of happening to you but never think will actually happen to you. And Jessie Burton very candidly wrote a post about the fact that she hadn't expected it to happen to her, and she didn't really cope very well with the fact that it had, because obviously, you know, you kind of dream of success, you don't imagine about the bad side and the anxiety and the pressure that it's put on you. Anyway, as I say, check that out. But since reading that, I have become absolutely obsessed with Jessie Burton. I follow her on Instagram, and her Instagram stories frankly make my life. I just think she's a very fascinating woman. She's also very inspired by Frida Kahlo and things, and she looks at feminist issues and feminist creativity, which is something that really comes up in this book. So this is a book which looks at two different women. So we start in 1967 London with a woman called Odell, who I believe is from Trinidad originally. I might be wrong there. But I think she's from Trinidad originally, and she has moved to London, and she's been there for about 6 years, and when we meet her, she's working in an artist gallery, but what she really wants to do is write, and she kind of writes in private and doesn't share it with anyone because she's frightened. And then the other woman we follow is in 1936, which is a girl called Olive. She's an English girl who was living in Spain during the lead up to the Spanish Civil War, and she is secretly painting, and basically it looks at without saying too much, it looks at the lengths that she's willing to go to get her art out there, even if she can't do it under her own name because she is obviously a woman. And in 1936, female artists were just not given as much respect as male artists. Effectively, the two stories do come together in varying ways, but mainly this just looks at the ongoing struggles that women have with creativity, no matter what time zone they're in, you know, the restraints that are put on women, and also the restraints that women put on themselves. And I think, especially knowing Jessie Burton struggle with the success of The Miniaturist, and I think she had quite a hard time with writing this book in the aftermath of that extreme success of her first book. I think this also looks at the struggle to create something in your own expectation that lives up to what you want it to be, I suppose. It's a fantastic book. I would say that there are points where it's a little bit convenient the way that the stories tie in, and there are points where you think, oh well, that's, you know, why would that all come together in one go? But ultimately I thoroughly enjoyed this. I think what I like about Jessie Burton's writing is that even though she is a best-selling author, and I can see why her books become sort of bestsellers, because they're very easy to read. They're the kind of books that you could just lock yourself away with and read in one sitting. They're so fast-paced. Even though this is quite a thick book, I think it took me about 3 days to read it. But what I like about her, as I say, is that she's a very literary writer as well. She's not afraid to be poetic with her words, and I really love her concept as well. So I would highly recommend this. I would say this probably more than The Miniaturist appealed to me. I think The Miniaturist was good, but it was kind of a novel that wasn't fully realised, whereas I think this is a much more realised altogether book. So yeah, I would highly recommend that one. And then I read my non-booktube book for the month, which was Death of the Snakecatcher by A.K. Welsapar. I have done a separate review of this, which I will link down below, so I won't say too much about it here. Basically, this is a collection of translated short stories which have come out of Turkmenistan, which is quite an oppressive country that I hadn't actually heard of before going into this book. I really enjoyed the stories in here, and I really enjoyed the concepts, and I think it's interesting because a lot of the stories obviously deal with issues of living in an oppressive state and the power of being in an oppressive situation, and sort of the mind games that the government can play with you in that situation. Which I thought was really fascinating, and I think this is an important book, given that it is one of only 2 translated texts to come out of Turkmenistan. The only slight niggle I had was with the translation, so there were a few strange translation choices in here. For instance, it's a short story collection, but it's translated by 3 different people, which I think kind of was jarring. I think it's nice to get the tone of an ongoing translator, and also there was, especially the first translator I found, chose very strange words and kind of, I didn't feel like the translation necessarily helped the story at all, but the stories themselves I really enjoyed. I don't think there was any that I couldn't get behind the plot of, so I would recommend this if you're interested in reading some translated fiction. And then I picked up Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. This was my sort of nod to Victober because I haven't really been reading any Victorian things. Now firstly I will say I love these Penguin Classics editions, but I think it's important to note that for the second time, I think this is the only the second one that I've ever actually read. I own a few, but this is the second one that I've actually picked up, and they are beautiful, but they have a real annoying habit of the pattern fading as you're reading them. It's faded a little bit on the front as well. Now weirdly, the other book I read, you could very much see that the fading was where my hands had sort of landed when I was reading it, which is kind of unavoidable. But with this one, I mean, I was trying to work out how this could have happened, and I really don't, I don't know, other than the fact that it might be from when it opens up and rubs against the spine perhaps, but yeah, my hands were not there when I was reading it. Anyway, so that's a slight niggle. I think they're really pretty, but it does frustrate me that the patterns come off very easily. It's for the book itself, I'm in 2 minds about this. Now this is only the 3rd Charles Dickens that I've read, and I have to say it's probably my least favourite. I've always loved the musical film of Oliver. I think it was one of my mum's favourites when I was a child, so it's a film that I know very well, and I assumed that I knew the story of Oliver Twist very well as a result of that. To some extent there are similarities, but there is basically a large middle section in the book that is taken out of the film. And I 100% agree with that creative decision because I thought the middle section was just dull. So for those of you who don't know, this is a story about an orphan boy called Oliver Twist, and it basically looks at his life and adventures and the hardships that he faces and his life getting mixed up with the wrong crowd, I suppose, with some thieves in London. Effectively, this is a story which looks at workhouses in the Victorian days and the way that orphan children were treated, and the way that poor people were treated generally. And in that sense, I really enjoyed this. I think the political message in the book was a lot stronger than it is in the film. Not that I'm comparing the two because the book came first. Let's just put the film to the side. So I really enjoyed the strength of the political message in this. The only thing I will say is, as I mentioned, the middle section is really slow. Now something that I enjoy about Dickens is that I expect him to be quite hard to read and quite heavy and dense, and he's not. He's very easy to read. I was flying through the first section and really enjoying it and finding it really compulsively readable when Oliver is in the workhouse and when he meets the Artful Dodger. Then the middle section is a part where he's effectively living in a rich house. He's not with the robbers that he met in the beginning, and I just felt like it was completely unnecessary. I feel like it really slowed the story, and it was about probably 100-200 pages long, so by the time I was finished with that I was kind of just bored of the story. I would also say that I'm kind of a little bit confused, and it might just be my ignorance or my not knowing enough about Dickens, but I was a little bit confused with the message of this story overall, because I understand that it's looking at the treatment of poor people and the way that poor people are sort of segregated and treated as villains, but ultimately I felt in the end as though he almost kind of inadvertently treated the poor people in his book in the same way as he was pointing out that they were being treated by society, if that makes any sense. So when Oliver is with the poor people, they're villains, he doesn't feel safe, he's in a dangerous situation, which obviously, you know, these people are living in this situation because they have no choice. So in that sense it works. But then there are 2 points in this book where Oliver moves in with rich people. He lands on his feet, as it were, and I felt as though it was almost saying that, you know, rich is safe and rich is good and poor is bad. And I don't know, as I say, it might just be that he's looking at it from the point of view of rich people can afford to be safe. I don't know, but ultimately I got a bit confused by that. And I would also say I don't think it's any secret that this book has terrible representation of the Jewish community in Fagin, and I found that pretty hard to stomach. As a general read, it was fine. There There were issues though, I'm not gonna lie, there were issues, not my favourite Dickens. Then I read another writing book for my writing workshop, which was How to Write a Damn Good Novel 2 by James N. Frey. Now firstly, can we just have a moment for how 90s this cover is? It's awful, it's awful, let's be frank about it. I would say that I didn't like half of this book and I really enjoyed the second half. So the reason I didn't like the beginning is because this book kind of looks at writing in some sense as quite a cinematic and a damn good novel thing. So it kind of looks at how to write a bestseller, which isn't particularly something that interests me. So it kind of, in that sense, it looks at it as more of a sort of general business kind of thing, which always puts me off. I don't appreciate books that look at writing as a business. There are also some things in here, like the language used, it hasn't aged well in certain ways. There are some derogatory terms. I also feel like there's a slight leaning towards male authors in this book. Other than that, and that aside, I did really enjoy the second section of this book. I think what this book does is it looks at basically the rules of writing that you're taught when you start writing, and it looks at what you can do with those rules when you start to develop your craft, when you start to understand the rules and you can start to sort of break them and step away from the things that you're told never to do. And in that sense I found it really interesting, because I think to some extent, and I've said before in the previous writing books that I've read for this course, is that to some extent, once you've read so many writing manuals, they do start repeating themselves. And this is probably the first writing manual in a long time I've read that really taught me something new. What I really liked at the end of this, also slight bias point, is that there is a section which talks about the fact that James N. Frey genuinely believes that if you have the passion to write a damn good novel, you will do it. It just takes time and patience, and you need to keep pushing. And he speaks about a lot of his students are people who have talent and they just grow frustrated and they give up before they've managed to do it, before they've managed to finish. He says if you persevere, if you're willing to persevere, if you've got the passion to persevere, you can do it. And I think that really was a nice pat on the back. Everyone else in my course, I would say, has also enjoyed this one and seems to talk about this one more than the other books we've mentioned, so I would recommend it. As I say, there were some small niggles for me in the beginning, but they definitely ironed out and I thoroughly enjoyed the last sections. And talking of enjoying things, I also read Written on the Body by Jeanette Winterson. Oh my god, I was not ready for this book, but it was so good. So I adore Jeanette Winterson, but I have had some bad experiences with her. I think the last book of hers I read was Sexing the Cherry, and it just didn't really strike a chord with me. I didn't really get it. I felt like it went over my head and it was kind of a slog to read in the end. So I've kind of been a bit disheartened with her. Because she is one of my favourite authors, and I think she's a person that I will always cite as one of my favourite authors, but I don't think everything that she writes is for me. So I kind of went into this prepared not to enjoy it, and I was so wrong. This is fantastic. It's hard to explain. Basically, it's told from the perspective of a non-named, non-sexed narrator. We never learn whether it's a male or a female, although I kind of think it's nice to think of it as a female, but I think the point is that they have no specific set gender, and it basically looks at this person's, it looks at their previous relationships, and predominantly their relationship with a woman called Louise, who is a married woman. And they start an affair and Louise leaves her husband for our nameless narrator. We look at their relationship and also the breakdown of their relationship for reasons which I won't go into. It's basically a love letter and a poem, and oh, it's just stunning. They say that this book kind of veers into the category of poetry at points. It's stunning, and it's really interesting reading it, actually, having done a writing course which is like focusing very much on how you create a story and how you build a story, because what I love about Jeanette Winterson is that she breaks all the rules. You know, everything that she does is stuff that you probably shouldn't do, but it works so well, and I think that's why nobody else writes like Jeanette Winterson. I've highlighted various places in this book that I could read to you. To read out this bit because it's stunning. 200 miles from the surface of the earth there is no gravity. The laws of motion are suspended. You could turn somersaults slowly, slowly, wait into weightlessness, nowhere to fall. As you lay on your back, paddling in space, you might notice your feet had fled your head. You were stretching slowly, slowly, getting longer. Your joints are slipping away from their usual places. There is no connection between your shoulder and your arm. You will break up bone by bone, fractured from who you are by drifting away now. The centre cannot hold. It's just truly striking. I've not read a book which got me this excited in a long time, and I just can't recommend it enough. It's also a very quick read. There's not much writing to a page in a general sense, but there's also a section in the middle that is very much like poetry, so there's barely any words on the page, so you can flick through this in probably 2 sittings. I would just highly recommend it if you're not afraid of experimental fiction, which is just frankly astounding. I would just highly recommend. So that's all the books I read this October. Not a bad lot all in all. Please let me know down below what you have been reading, and I will see you next time. Bye.